Fabuloso lavender and burnt coffee. That was the smell of the woman nobody at the Miami compound had bothered to learn the last name of. 11 seconds. That was how long it took her to turn a countdown into a rounding error. Before that, there was a room full of grown men frozen like store mannequins, a 9-year-old asleep 2 floors up, and a red digital number that had already passed 40. Nobody screamed. Screaming costs a half-second nobody had. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain. She just moved, the way water moves toward the lowest point, like she'd done this before, in a life none of them had bothered to ask about. When it was over, the room stayed quiet a beat too long. Nobody clapped. Nobody breathed either. 3 weeks earlier, none of it. 3 weeks earlier there was only 5:14 a.m. and the particular ache that lived behind Marisol Aguilar's left hip, the one that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with 11 years of lifting other people's children off other people's tile floors. The apartment smelled the way it always smelled at that hour, fabuloso lavender ground into the linoleum from the night before, and under it, the ghost of burnt coffee she'd forgotten on the stove twice that week because sleep kept winning fights it shouldn't have won. $211. That was the gap between what was in her checking account and what her landlord, Mr. Petrolson, wanted by the 5th, in cash or cashier's check, no exceptions, no excuses, a man who wore his key ring like a threat. She was 34. She looked, in the wrong light, older, and in the right light, like someone who used to run somewhere fast and important and had simply stopped one day without telling anyone why. Her hands told a different story than her resume did. Calluses in the wrong places for a woman who, on paper, had spent the last 6 years pushing strollers and wiping applesauce off high chairs. The resume said Miami Beach Nanny Agency, 5 placements, excellent references. It didn't say anything about the 11 years before that. Nobody had asked. In Miami, nobody asks the woman who folds your towels what she used to be. The bus was the 120, the one that smelled like wet umbrellas even in dry season, the one that took 51 minutes to go 4 miles because it stopped for everyone, and she used those 51 minutes the way she used everything else in her life now, economically, without waste, staring out a window at a city that had a lot of glass and very little warmth. Her son Mateo was 7 and lived 412 miles away in Immokalee with her mother because childcare in Miami cost more than childcare paid, an arithmetic so absurd it had become a kind of dark joke between her and the ceiling at 3 a.m. She called him every night at 7:30. He always answered on the second ring, like he'd been sitting by the phone the whole day just for that. The Alvarez family, not their real employer, the one before, a nice enough couple with a nice enough toddler and a habit of leaving 40-cent tips folded into thank you notes, had let her go 2 months prior. Downsizing, they'd said, the same week they bought a Tesla. She'd taken the news the way she took most news, with her spine very straight and her face doing absolutely nothing, and then cried exactly once, in the stairwell, for 4 minutes, because 4 minutes was all she allowed herself for anything. Before the Alvarez toddler there had been a string of others, 3 families in 4 years, each one a small negotiation in how much of herself she was allowed to bring to work. The Kowalskis, who'd asked her, in the interview, whether she had any military background, anything like that, just curious, and she'd said no, clean and flat, and gotten the job on the strength of the lie. The Pattersons, whose twin girls she'd loved with a ferocity that scared her a little, gone within 8 months when Mr. Patterson's firm relocated to Charlotte and nobody thought to ask if she wanted to come. She didn't let herself get attached anymore, not fully, not past a certain line she'd drawn for herself somewhere around year 2. Attachment was a debt you paid back in grief, and grief was expensive, and she was already carrying more debt than one woman could reasonably service. Her own mother, back in Immokalee, had a bad hip and a roof with a leak over the kitchen that had gone from a stain to a drip to, as of last month, a small tin bucket that needed emptying twice a day when it rained. Marisol sent what she could, which was never what she wanted to send, and her mother never once complained, which was somehow worse than if she had. Mateo had his father's eyes and none of his father's habit of disappearing when things got hard. That particular trait, apparently, skipped a generation and landed instead in Marisol herself, who had disappeared once, fully, from an entire country and an entire version of who she used to be, and had never quite explained to her own son why. She kept a coffee can on the top shelf of her kitchen cabinet with $340 in crumpled bills inside it, money that didn't exist anywhere. A bank could freeze it or a court could garnish it, the last remaining habit from a life where cash you could see and touch was the only kind of safety that meant anything. The can was for emergencies. The can had been slowly, steadily shrinking for 6 weeks, and Marisol had started doing the math on it the way she did math on everything now, not with panic. Panic was a luxury, but with the same cold, procedural clarity she'd once used to calculate blast radii. The agency had one listing left that fit her availability. Private residence. Coconut Grove. Live out. $22 an hour, which sounded like money until you did the math on gas and the 120 bus and the fact that live out for a compound like that one meant showing up by 6 a.m. and sometimes not leaving until midnight, no overtime, don't ask. The house, if house was the word for 11,000 square feet behind a 9-foot wall, smelled before she ever saw it. Chlorine first, sharp and municipal, from a pool the size of a parking lot. Then jasmine, planted in a thick hedge along the drive like the estate was trying to apologize for the wall. Under both, faint, almost nothing, gun oil. She noticed it the way you notice a splinter before you feel it. The boy's name was Sammy. 9 years old, allergic to peanuts and, apparently, to eye contact with adults he hadn't decided to trust yet. He ate off-brand goldfish because the brand name ones tasted like plastic, a distinction Marisol privately thought was insane and publicly never mentioned. He wore SPF 50 sunscreen that smelled like coconut and chemicals, applied by Marisol every morning at 7:15 whether he wanted it or not, an argument she won every single day through sheer patient repetition. Within 4 days he'd started leaving his door open a crack when she came to wake him. Within a week he'd stopped flinching when she touched his shoulder. Children learn who is safe faster than adults do. They just don't have the vocabulary to explain how they know. The father was a name Marisol had heard before she'd ever set foot on the property, the way you hear about weather before it arrives. Adrian Voss. Men who work security detail at the gate didn't call him Mr. Voss. They called him nothing at all, which told her more than a name would have. He smelled, on the rare occasions their paths crossed in a hallway, like cedar and gun oil and something colder underneath, expensive and metallic, like the inside of a bank vault. He didn't speak to staff unless there was a reason. When he did speak, he said the smallest possible number of words and then waited, perfectly still, until the room adjusted itself around the silence. People who worked for him didn't relax when he left a room. They exhaled instead, all at once, like a held note finally releasing. Marisol had learned, within her first 10 days, the shape of the house's fear. Not of Adrian Voss shouting, she never once heard him raise his voice, but of Adrian Voss going quiet. The quiet was the weapon. She'd watched a caterer's assistant drop an entire tray of stone crab claws rather than be the one still moving when he went still. She filed the observation away without judgment. She'd known men like that before. She'd been trained, once, a lifetime ago, to walk into rooms exactly like the one he ran and not flinch either. Nobody at the compound knew that. The house staff had their own hierarchy, invisible to anyone above it, and Marisol had slotted into the bottom rung within her first hour without a single word being exchanged about it. There was Carmen, who ran the kitchen and had opinions about everyone that she delivered in a rapid, affectionate Spanish nobody upstairs bothered to learn. There was a groundskeeper named Ori who watered the jasmine hedge every morning at 6:40 exactly and never once looked directly at the main house, a habit Marisol recognized as its own kind of survival strategy. There was a rotating cast of security men who treated the household staff as furniture in exactly the way Marisol had decided to be furniture, which suited her fine. Invisibility was a mutual agreement, and everyone in that house had signed it without a pen. Sammy's mother was not in the picture. Nobody explained why, and Marisol didn't ask, the same way she didn't ask about the gun oil smell or the men who came through the gate at odd hours in cars with paper plates. There was a photograph in Sammy's room, though, on the nightstand, a woman with Sammy's same wide-set eyes, and once, only once, in her second week, Marisol had found the boy sitting on his floor at midnight holding that photograph with both hands, not crying, just holding it, and she'd sat down next to him on the carpet without a word and stayed there until he fell back asleep, and neither of them had ever mentioned it again. By her third week, Marisol had mapped the compound the way she used to map forward operating bases, not out of any plan, just out of a body that refused to stop doing what it had once been trained to do. She knew which door stuck in humidity and took an extra half-second to open, information that mattered to nobody except a woman who'd once needed to know exactly how many seconds a door would cost her. She knew the guard rotation changed at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. and that the 6 p.m. shift always ran 4 minutes late because the incoming man stopped to smoke a cigarette by the service entrance first. She knew, without ever once being told, that the house ran on fear dressed up as loyalty, the same way certain military units she'd served with had run, and she recognized both the efficiency of it and the exhaustion underneath it, because that exhaustion lived in her own chest too, every single day, whether she was folding towels or clearing a wire. That was the arrangement she'd made with herself, the morning she'd walked through that gate for the first time, be furniture. Furniture doesn't get fired for asking questions, because furniture doesn't ask questions. Furniture gets left alone. She had 11 years of very good reasons to want to be left alone, and $211 due on the 5th was only the smallest and most recent of them. Morning arrived on a Tuesday with the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet, the air thick enough to chew, and Marisol was in the kitchen wiping down a goldfish-crumbed counter when the first black SUV came through the gate too fast, gravel spitting, and Sammy's father crossed the courtyard at a pace she had never once seen him use. 11:31 a.m. someone had found something in the pool house. By 11:34, the compound had the particular, terrible stillness of a hospital waiting room. 6 men in dark suits stood in a loose perimeter around the pool house door, none of them looking at each other, all of them looking at their phones like the phones might tell them what to do. A 7th man, young, sweating through a linen shirt that had cost more than Marisol's monthly rent, stood closest to the door, and his hands would not stop shaking, and Marisol, folding towels 40 feet away where nobody had told her to stop working, watched those hands and understood, with the flat certainty of someone reading a familiar language, exactly what kind of morning this was about to become. 11:38, Adrian Voss came out of the pool house with his jaw doing something very controlled and very wrong. "Get the boy upstairs," he said. 4 words. Nobody moved for a full second, because 4 words from him usually meant something was about to be destroyed, and everyone was recalibrating who. "Now," he said, and that word alone cleared the courtyard of children. Marisol, folding towels, did not go anywhere. Furniture doesn't run. But her pulse had already climbed into her throat, a hard mechanical throb she recognized the way you recognize an old scar aching before rain. 11:41, somebody, a man with a shaved head and a Bluetooth earpiece that had gone from cool authority to visible panic in under 90 seconds, came sprinting from the pool house shouting a word that emptied Marisol's lungs before her brain even finished parsing it. Device. 11:42, 18 minutes. The compound's head of security, a barrel-chested man named Reyes who Marisol had clocked in her first week as the kind of man who'd been in actual rooms with actual stakes, was on his phone shouting coordinates to a bomb squad that was, according to the dispatcher's voice leaking tinny through the speaker, 26 minutes out on a good day, and today was not, according to traffic, a good day. 18 minutes of device. 26 minutes of help. Cold arithmetic. Somebody was going to lose that subtraction. "Everybody off the property," Reyes said, sweat cutting a clean line down his temple. "Now. Go, go, go." Adrian Voss stood exactly where he was, not moving, staring at the pool house door like he could stare the 18 minutes into 26 through sheer force of will, and Marisol watched something happen to his face that she suspected almost nobody alive had ever been permitted to see: fear, plain and unhidden, the fear of a man realizing that all his money and all his violence had, for the first time in his life, absolutely nothing to offer him. He had built an empire, in 11 years, on the specific promise that nothing touched the people who paid him for protection. That was the whole architecture of the fear that kept his world running, the understanding that Adrian Voss could reach anywhere, fix anything, make any problem disappear before it finished becoming a problem. 18 minutes of device against 26 minutes of help was the first math in a decade he could not solve with a phone call, and everyone in that courtyard could see him doing the arithmetic over and over, the same losing subtraction, his hands opening and closing at his sides with nothing to grab onto. "Call the second squad," he said to Reyes, low and fast. The private one, out of Doral. 40 minutes, boss, they're further. Call them anyway. It wasn't logic. It was a man reaching for any lever left to pull, and Reyes, to his credit, dialed anyway rather than say the obvious thing out loud, which was that no lever existed that could turn 18 minutes into more than 18 minutes. 2 floors up, behind a window Marisol could just see from the courtyard, a curtain twitched, and a small pale face pressed against the glass for half a second before someone, a nanny from the agency's overnight relief roster, filling in while the real chaos of daytime unfolded below, pulled him back out of sight. Marisol's stomach dropped at the flash of that face, and something in her chest reorganized itself, fast and total, the way triage reorganizes a person's priorities without asking permission first. She should have walked to the gate with everyone else. That was the plan. Furniture followed. Be small. Be gone. Don't be the thing anyone remembers when this is over. But there was a boy 2 floors up who ate off-brand goldfish because the good ones tasted like plastic, and there was a version of Marisol Aguilar that 11 years of folding towels had not, it turned out, fully buried. She put down the towel. Nobody was watching her. That was the last useful thing about being furniture. She crossed 40 feet of courtyard and nobody registered it as motion worth tracking, not until she was 3 feet from the pool house door and Reyes's arm shot out, reflexive, a wall of muscle and panic. You need to. How long since the timer started, she said. Not a question. A request for data, flat and immediate, in a voice none of them had heard her use in 3 weeks of being nobody. Reyes blinked at her like she'd spoken in a language he half recognized from somewhere far away. 22 minutes, maybe. Who? Where's the case? Under the pump housing. This isn't. She was already past him. The pool house smelled like chlorine and hot vinyl and, underneath, something acrid and industrial that had no business being there, ammonium nitrate and something sweeter, a smell she recognized in her spine before her mind caught up and named it. The device sat wedged behind the pump housing exactly where Reyes said, a grey plastic case the size of a lunchbox, wires, red, yellow, a single stray green, running to a small board with a red digital display counting down in numbers too fast to argue with. 9:14. Silence beat. Behind her, in the doorway, Adrian Voss had appeared without a sound, the way dangerous men learn to move, and his voice, when it came, was quiet in the specific way that made grown men in his employ go still. Get out of my pool house. She didn't turn around. Somebody get me a flashlight and pull that man in the linen shirt out of the doorway, he's blocking my light. I said. I heard you. Her hands were already at the casing, testing the screws with a fingernail, feeling for the give in the plastic the way you feel for a pulse. You can shoot me after. Right now you can help or you can stand there being expensive. Silence beat. Nobody in that pool house had ever heard anyone talk to Adrian Voss that way and live past the sentence. Reyes's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Adrian Voss did not shoot her, did not speak, did not move. He simply stood in the doorway with his jaw locked and watched a woman he had never once looked directly at in 3 weeks unscrew a bomb casing with hands that were not shaking at all. 8:51. Flashlight, she said again, not raising her voice, and this time somebody scrambled to obey. Under the light, the wiring told its own story, the way wiring always does if you know its language, a redundant trigger, amateur but not stupid, somebody who'd learned from forums and overcompensated with a second failsafe that, ironically, gave her exactly the diagnostic window she needed. Her fingers moved without hesitation now, the 11-year-old muscle memory surfacing whole and intact, like a language she'd sworn never to speak again arriving fully formed the moment the room demanded it. 8:03. She traced the yellow wire to a secondary junction, found what she expected to find, and exhaled once, short, through her nose. Somebody's phone. Camera flash, on, pointed here. Her voice hadn't changed pitch once. Not you, she added, when the man in the sweated-through linen shirt fumbled his phone twice. You. The one who isn't shaking. Reyes, wordless, held his phone steady. 7:40. Then the seconds started disappearing faster than the room could track them, because Marisol Aguilar had stopped narrating and started working, and the only sounds left in the pool house were the hum of a filtration system nobody had thought to turn off and the small, precise clicks of a woman doing something she had once been paid by a government to do and had promised herself, on a plane out of a country she never named out loud, that she would never do again. She cut the red wire first, a decoy. She knew it the second the timer didn't blink, then, without pause, without a breath of hesitation, went straight for the actual trigger circuit hidden under a second, false board, the kind only somebody who'd built these things herself would think to look for. 11 seconds. Start to finish, from the moment her fingers touched the true circuit to the moment the red display froze, dead, at 0:04. Silence beat. A long one. The filtration pump kept humming, the only sound in a room where 6 grown men and one very dangerous one had all, apparently, forgotten how lungs worked. Marisol sat back on her heels, wiped her palms once on her khakis, and looked up at nobody in particular. "It's dead," she said. "Somebody call the actual bomb squad and tell them to bring gloves for evidence, not for defusal. There's nothing left to defuse." Nobody clapped. Nobody breathed either, not for a beat too long to be comfortable, and in that beat Adrian Voss, a man whose face, by every account Marisol had gathered second-hand over 3 weeks of being invisible, had not registered surprise since some unrecorded year in his 20s, stood in the doorway of his own pool house and said absolutely nothing at all, because for the first time in longer than anyone in that room could remember, he had nothing ready to say. It wasn't relief on his face. It was arithmetic, running backward, trying and failing to make her fit any column he already had. "Who," he said finally, and it came out rougher than his usual quiet, "are you?" Marisol stood, brushed dust off her knees, and picked her towel back up off the pool deck where she dropped it without noticing. "Sam is nanny," she said. "I should go check on him. He gets scared during storms and this counts." She walked out of the pool house into weather that had finally decided to break, fat rain hitting concrete in a smell of ozone and hot asphalt, and left 11 grown men standing in stunned silence behind her. By midnight, the storm had passed and the compound smelled like wet jasmine and chlorine gone flat, and Marisol was in the small guest bathroom off the kitchen scrubbing bomb residue off her hands for the 4th time, when Reyes found her. "Boss wants to see you. Tell the boss I have a bus to catch. He sent a car." Reyes's face did something complicated. "He doesn't send cars." She dried her hands on a paper towel, folded it in a neat square out of 11 years of habit, and followed him. Adrian Voss's study smelled like cedar, leather, and, faintly, gun oil, the way she'd expected it would, a scent that had apparently colonized the whole man rather than one part of him. He stood behind a desk the size of her entire apartment kitchen, not sitting, hands flat on the wood, and he studied her the way you study a bill you're not sure you can pay. "Army," he said. "Not a question." Something like that. She didn't sit either. Nobody had offered. "EOD. I don't do that anymore." "You just did it." 11 seconds. "My guy on the phone with the actual squad says the average defusal on a device like that runs 8 to 12 minutes, and that's with the right tools and no clock running." He tilted his head, a small, precise motion, the kind of gesture that in a lesser man would have looked curious and in him looked like calculation. "You did it in 11 seconds with a phone flashlight. I got lucky with the wiring. Whoever built it wasn't as good as they thought." "You're lying." "I'm being modest. There's a difference, but you probably don't get a lot of practice telling them apart." Silence beat. Something moved behind his eyes that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm offering you a job," he said. "Real money. Security consultant. 6 figures, benefits, a car that isn't a bus." "No." He blinked. People, apparently, did not say no to him twice in one day, and both times had now been the same woman. "You didn't hear the number." "I heard it." The answer's still no. She kept her voice level, the way you keep a level voice with a dog that hasn't decided yet whether to bite. "You pay me on a 1099 for something like that, I owe the IRS money I don't have by April, and my current visa status for working private security in this state requires a license I don't hold and can't get without a background check that would surface exactly the things I came to this country to stop being surfaced. And there's a landlord who wants $211 by Friday, not sometime after your legal team finishes drafting paperwork. I need a check I can cash tomorrow, not a title I can't insure myself under. He watched her for a long moment, the kind of look she imagined he gave contracts before he signed them. You've thought about this? I think about everything. It's a bad habit from a worse job. $211, he repeated, very quietly, like the number itself offended him on some structural level. That's what stands between my son's nanny and rent. That's what stands between most people and rent, Mr. Voss. You've just never had to look at the number before. She left the study without being dismissed, which she suspected was itself some kind of violation of protocol, and nobody stopped her, because nobody in that house currently knew what the rules were anymore. She rode the 120 home that night with wet hair and a folded 20. Someone, Reyes, probably, gilt money, unasked for, had pressed into her palm on the way out, and she stared out the window at a city lit up gold and indifferent, and told herself, the way she'd told herself 100 times in 100 other countries, that walking away was the safe choice, the smart choice, the only choice a woman with a kid in Immokalee could afford to make. She believed it for exactly 6 days. 6 days of the agency not calling with new placements. 6 days of Mr. Petrolzen's key ring rattling outside her door on the morning of the 6th, a visual threat rather than a verbal one, more effective for it. 6 days of Mateo's voice on the phone asking, in the careful, adult way 7-year-olds develop when they've learned to read their mother's silences, whether she was okay, whether they'd have to move again, whether Abuela's roof was going to keep leaking or whether this was the month they finally fixed it. On the 7th day, a car she recognized, black, tinted, patient, was parked outside her building when she came out for the bus. The window rolled down. Reyes, not Voss, behind the wheel this time, which she understood immediately as a courtesy, a way of letting her decline without an audience that mattered. He's not asking you back as security, Reyes said. Sammy won't eat. Hasn't since you left. Won't talk about why. Silence beat. The particular kind that has nothing to do with bombs and everything to do with a 9-year-old who'd finally, carefully, decided someone was safe, only to watch her disappear the same week his father's house nearly killed him. That's not fair, Marisol said. No, Reyes agreed. It isn't. She got in the car. The ride back to the compound took 11 minutes, and Marisol spent every one of them rehearsing the version of this where she stayed strictly professional, strictly temporary, in and out, a favor for a boy and nothing more. Reyes didn't fill the silence with small talk, which she appreciated more than she let on. He drove like a man who understood that some passengers needed the quiet more than they needed conversation. The gate this time opened without the usual pause for camera verification. Someone had cleared her before she'd even arrived, which told her something about how this reinstatement had already been decided, before she'd said a single word of agreement, before Reyes had even pulled up outside her building that morning. It should have bothered her more than it did. She filed the observation the way she filed everything now, without comment, and walked back through a door she'd been certain, 6 days earlier, she'd shut for good. Sammy was in the kitchen when she came in, sitting at the counter with an untouched bowl of cereal gone soft in front of him, and when he saw her his whole face did something it hadn't done in 6 days, according to Carmen, who stood by the stove with her arms crossed and her eyes wet. You came back, Sammy said, like he was testing whether the sentence was safe to believe. I came back, Marisol said, and sat down next to him, and didn't say anything else about jobs or money or the number Adrian Voss had offered in his study, because none of that belonged in this particular kitchen, at this particular moment, between a woman and a boy who had both, in their own ways, learned exactly how much it costs when the people you count on disappear. It was, she told herself, riding back through streets that smelled like cut grass and hot pavement, about the boy. It was not about the number Adrian Voss had said in his study, 6 figures, a real check, a way out of a $211 gap that had started to feel less like a hole and more like a permanent address. It was not about the way he'd looked at her like she'd rewritten some equation he'd spent his whole life assuming was fixed. She told herself all of that, and some small, honest part of her, the part that had once defused 11 of these in a single deployment and walked away from every one with her hand steady, knew she was lying, and knew the lie was a beautiful one, and got back into the trap anyway, eyes open, because the alternative, $211, a landlord's key ring, a boy in Immokalee reading her silences, had stopped being a choice at all. The weeks between held their own small education. Marisol learned the compound's real rhythms now that she was inside them properly instead of skirting their edges, learned that Adrian Voss ran 3 legitimate businesses out of a downtown office tower and at least 2 illegitimate ones out of a warehouse near the port that nobody spoke of by name, learned that Reyes had a wife and 2 daughters in Westchester he called every night at exactly 9, learned that the young men who came and went through the gate in expensive cars were, more often than she wanted to admit, barely older than the boys she used to worry about back in Immokalee, dressed up in money and violence like a costume none of them had fully grown into yet. She spent her mornings with Sammy, sunscreen and goldfish and the small, sacred rituals of a childhood trying to happen despite everything built up around it, and her afternoons doing the quieter work of the job Voss had actually hired her for, walking properties before events, checking blind spots, running background on caterers and florists and anyone else who'd be granted access to a gate that had, once already, failed to stop something it should have stopped. She was good at it. Better than good. The work fit her the way her old boots used to fit, worn into a shape that matched her exactly, and some nights she caught herself almost grateful for the 11 years that had carved that shape into her in the first place, before immediately feeling guilty for the gratitude. Adrian Voss kept his distance during those weeks, or something that looked like distance from the outside. He still didn't speak to staff unless there was a reason, still went quiet instead of loud, still cleared rooms with silence alone. But she noticed, because noticing was the only skill she trusted completely anymore, that his eyes tracked her differently now. Not the flat, cataloging look he gave everyone else on his payroll. Something slower. Something that lingered a half-second longer than professional distance required, and then corrected itself, every time, like a man disciplining a reflex he hadn't given himself permission to have. The second test came 4 weeks later, and it did not smell like chlorine or jasmine. It smelled like diesel exhaust and hot rubber and, underneath, the particular metallic tang of a warehouse that had once processed seafood and now processed things Marisol had learned, by 4 weeks in, not to ask questions about. She was on the payroll now, properly, this time, licensed, background checked through channels that had somehow scrubbed her old file clean in a way that would have taken her a decade to arrange on her own, a favor she understood came with a price she hadn't yet been billed for. Her title, on paper, was Household Risk Consultant. In practice, she went where Adrian Voss went, 3 steps behind and to the left, invisible in the specific way she'd always been invisible, except now people in that world noticed the invisibility and were afraid of it. The warehouse deal was supposed to be simple. A meeting, a handoff, 12 men on his side and 8 on the other, a negotiation over territory that had gone smooth in the pre-calls and should have stayed smooth in the room. Marisol had done the walkthrough that morning, the way she did every walkthrough now, checking sight lines and exits with the flat professional thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way what happens when nobody checks. She found the second exfil route was blocked before anyone else noticed the truck parked across it wasn't supposed to be there. She found the earpiece frequency running a half-second delay before anyone else noticed the room's rhythm had gone subtly, dangerously wrong. And she found the man, young, nervous, standing too close to Adrian Voss's right shoulder with a jacket zipped too high for 86-degree heat, reaching for something under that jacket a full second and a half before he actually reached, because she'd spent 11 years learning to read the half-second before the half-second. She didn't shout a warning. Warnings cost time. She crossed the space between them in 4 strides and had his wrist locked and the weapon on the concrete floor before most of the room had registered movement at all, and in the ringing silence that followed, the specific silence of 20 armed men realizing simultaneously how close they'd all just come to something none of them wanted to explain to their bosses, the 8 men from the other crew scattered backward in a ragged half-circle, hands raised without being told to raise them. Because a woman moving that fast, that certain, reads as its own kind of authority no title can manufacture. Adrian Voss looked down at the gun on the floor, then at the young man now on his knees with Marisol's forearm locked across his throat, and said 4 words in a voice gone glacially, terrifyingly calm. "Whose crew is he?" Nobody answered fast enough. That, in itself, was an answer. Reyes. Voss didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Find out who sent him. Then have a conversation with whoever it was. Somewhere private. Boss. I said private, Reyes. I didn't say gentle. He said it the way another man might order dry cleaning picked up, and the room's temperature dropped 10 degrees around the sentence, and Marisol, releasing the young man's wrist to the two guards who came to take him, understood with total clarity exactly what kind of consequence had just been ordered, delivered in a tone so mild it took the room a beat to catch up to its own horror. Silence beat. They drove back to the compound in a black SUV that smelled like leather and, faintly, cordite from a gun that had come very close to going off in a crowded room, and Adrian Voss sat across from her in the back seat, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not surprised this time. Something closer to a debt he didn't know how to pay. You saved my life twice in a month, he said. I did my job twice in a month. That's not the same thing and you know it. She looked out the window at Miami sliding by, glass towers catching the last orange light, and said nothing for a long stretch, long enough that he seemed to accept the silence as its own kind of answer. The kid tonight, she said eventually. He was scared. Scared people are sloppy, but they're also predictable, and predictable is the only reason I saw it coming a second and a half early instead of a second and a half late. Whoever sent him didn't train him properly. That's not loyalty test material. That's someone testing whether you've gotten soft since you hired a nanny to run your risk assessment. Voss's jaw tightened at that, the calculation returning to his eyes, the study office version of him surfacing again through the cracks. You think this was about you? I think this was about finding out whether the 11 seconds in the pool house was a fluke or a pattern. Somebody wanted to know what they were dealing with before they committed anything bigger. She met his eyes across the back seat, steady, unflinching. You should be asking who had access to your morning schedule. That kid knew exactly which door to stand near and exactly how long he'd have before anyone reacted. That's not luck. That's a leak. Silence beat. Voss said nothing for the rest of the ride, but she watched him take the observation and file it somewhere behind his eyes, the same cold, procedural place she filed things herself, and she understood, watching him do it, that whatever this was becoming between them, it had already stopped being just about a debt he thought he owed her. By midnight the compound had gone quiet the way it only went quiet after something bad had almost happened and everyone was too tired to keep performing calm. Marisol found herself on the back terrace with a glass of wine she hadn't asked for and Adrian Voss 2 feet away, leaning on the rail, jacket off, sleeves rolled, a version of him she'd never once seen in 4 weeks of watching him from the edges of rooms. The night smelled like his cedar and something underneath it she hadn't caught before, salt, ocean, coming off the bay behind the property, and under that, faint, a cheap detergent that didn't match his suits at all, an old smell, a poor smell, the kind that clings to a person from childhood no matter how much money they later spend trying to scrub it off. You grew up broke, she said. It wasn't a question either, the way his had never been questions. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost the study office edge. Liberty City. My mother cleaned office buildings on Brickell at 4 a.m. so rich people could walk into clean lobbies and never once wonder who'd been there before dawn. And now you own one of the buildings. Now I own 3 of them. A short, humorless laugh. Doesn't change the smell of the detergent. I still buy the same brand my mother used. Can't explain that to anyone who didn't grow up the same way. You don't have to explain it to me. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the pool house doorway, except this time there was no fear in it, just a kind of stripped, careful attention. His hand found her wrist where it rested on the rail, not grabbing, just resting there, thumb tracing once, lightly, over the faint scar tissue on the inside of her forearm, old and pale, the kind of mark that comes from a job that leaves marks. Where'd you get this? Kandahar. A wire I misjudged by half a second, 11 years ago. I don't talk about it. I noticed you don't talk about most things. Neither do you. We might be the same kind of person wearing different clothes. Silence beat, the charged kind now, not the fearful kind, the air between them gone thick and specific, his thumb still tracing that old scar like he was memorizing it, her pulse doing something inconvenient and entirely unrelated to bombs. "I'm not a safe person to want," he said quietly. "I noticed that too." She didn't move her wrist away. "I've made a career out of things that aren't safe." "Tell me something true," he said, low, the study office edge fully gone now, just a man in the dark with his thumb resting on an old scar. "Something you haven't told anyone in this city." She considered lying. It would have been easy, a reflex as old as the scar itself. Instead she found herself saying, "I had a unit. 9 of us, EOD, 2 deployments together. We had a rule, nobody talks about home while we're working, because home makes your hands shake, and shaking hands get people killed. So I stopped talking about home. Then I stopped talking about anything. Then I came back to a country that didn't need what I knew how to do anymore, and I found out I'd forgotten how to be a person who wasn't diffusing something. And the nanny work. Turns out watching a kid for 8 hours a day requires almost exactly the same muscles. Constant threat assessment. Total presence. Just usually the stakes are goldfish crackers instead of ordnance." A short, surprised laugh escaped her, the first one he'd heard from her in 5 weeks, and something in his face shifted at the sound of it, unguarded, almost boyish. "Your turn," she said. "Something true." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I told myself for 15 years that everyone who works for me is replaceable. It's the only way to run what I run. You can't get attached. Attachment gets people killed the same way your shaking hands do. Then a nanny disarmed a bomb in my pool house in 11 seconds and put a gun on the floor of a warehouse 2 weeks later, and I've spent every night since trying to figure out how to make you the exception without admitting to myself that's what I'm doing." Silence beat. The charged kind, gone very still now, the air between them close enough that she could feel the heat coming off his chest, could smell nothing but cedar and salt and old detergent, could hear her own pulse doing something loud and entirely unprofessional in her ears. Neither of them closed the distance. That was its own kind of answer, the held breath before a wire gets cut, the moment where everything could still go either way, and they stood there on the terrace with the bay salt and cedar and old detergent all mixed together in the dark, close enough to feel each other's heat, far enough to still call it nothing, until Sammy's voice came thin and small through the open window above them, a nightmare, calling for her, not his father, for her, and Marisol pulled back first, because some habits outrank even this. "I have a boy to check on," she said. "Which one? Does it matter?" She left him on the terrace with his hand still half raised where her wrist had been, and climbed the stairs toward a 9-year-old's nightmare, her own pulse refusing, the whole way up, to slow back down to furniture speed. 3 days passed in the strange, suspended quiet that follows a near miss, the kind of quiet Marisol recognized from every deployment she'd ever finished without losing anyone, the body still braced for impact days after the danger had technically passed. Reyes had spent those 3 days running down the leak she'd flagged in the car, quietly, without fanfare, the way real security work actually got done, and had come back with nothing solid yet, which worried Marisol more than a solid answer would have. A leak that couldn't be found quickly was usually a leak that had been planted carefully, by someone who understood exactly how this house operated from the inside. Adrian Voss had scheduled a garden party for that Saturday, donors, he called them, though Marisol had stopped believing there was a meaningful line anymore between his legitimate businesses and the rest of it. 40 guests, a jazz trio, a raw bar, the kind of event that required exactly the sort of outside vendor access that made her nervous on principle even before 3 days earlier had given her a specific reason to be. She'd walked the vendor list herself that morning, cross-referencing names against the agency rosters and licenses the way she'd learned to in her 4 weeks on payroll, and everything had checked out clean, every name, every van, every permit accounted for and verified twice. It was the cleanliness of it, in fact, that should have bothered her sooner. Real events were never this clean. Real events had a spilled tray, a late van, a mismatched name on a clipboard. This one ran like it had been rehearsed. 3 days later, a man Marisol had never seen before walked through the compound's front gate wearing a caterer's uniform 2 sizes too clean for someone who claimed to have been unloading trucks all morning, and something in her spine, the same old language, never fully retired no matter how many years she tried, went cold and certain before her conscious mind had finished the thought. She was setting the pool house's outdoor table, close enough to see the way his hands didn't move like a caterer's hands, close enough to catch, under the rented uniform, a smell that didn't belong at a garden party at all, sweat, and gun oil, and something sweet and chemical she'd catalogued, once, in a country far from here, in a life she'd promised herself she'd left behind. She set down the last plate very carefully, the way you set down something that might still go off, and did not look up right away. "Sammy," she said, keeping her voice at exactly the pitch she used for bedtime stories, easy, unbothered, the voice of someone with absolutely nowhere urgent to be, "why don't we go check if the kitchen has any of the good goldfish today? Not the fake ones. The real kind." "You said the real kind tastes like plastic." "I lied." "Let's go check anyway." She took his hand and started walking, slow, unhurried, toward the house, already counting exits in her head, already cataloguing the caterer's uniform and the gate log and the particular way Reyes's radio had gone quiet 40 seconds earlier when it should have crackled with the afternoon's routine check-in, already doing, without a single wasted motion, the thing 11 years and one nanny agency had never quite managed to teach out of her. "Is something wrong?" Sammy asked, because 9-year-olds who've learned to read silences read this one too. Marisol Aguilar smiled at him, easy, warm, entirely unhurried. The exact tone she'd used to promise him the good goldfish were definitely, absolutely in the kitchen. "Nope," she said. "Just hungry." 2 of the strongest, most dangerous men in Miami's underworld had spent that entire summer building a fortress nobody could breach, a wall 9 feet high, a gate with a guard rotation and cameras on every angle, and none of it, not $1 of it, had ever once accounted for the woman who mixed the sunscreen and folded the towels and knew, faster and better than any of them, exactly what was coming. "We started this one with a bomb that took 11 seconds to stop mattering, and we're ending it with a woman walking calmly toward a kitchen that may not have any goldfish crackers in it at all." Marisol Aguilar came to that compound broke, exhausted, and invisible, and by the end of one summer she'd become the only person Adrian Voss trusted with the 2 things he actually loved, his son's life, and, whether he'd admit it out loud yet or not, his own. What was waiting behind that caterer's uniform? And how many more of Adrian Voss's oldest secrets is Marisol about to find herself standing directly in the middle of? Tell me what you think happens next in the comments, who's really behind that gate, and whether Marisol should have ever gotten back in that car. If this one had you holding your breath, hit like, share it with someone who needs a story like this today, and subscribe with the bell on for the next chapter.